Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about what Angrist and Kruger find, and then think a little bit about how we should understand those findings and how to interpret those findings. So the first thing we need to care about, if we think about their findings, is whether they find evidence that draft numbers are in fact related to education sufficiently for us to be able to conclude anything about the effect of education on earnings. Then we're going to want to know, based on the evidence from draft numbers, how education is measured to affect earnings, which is really to say how draft numbers affect earnings relative to how draft numbers affect education. And then finally, we're going to think a little bit more carefully about how to deal with this problem of draft numbers also being associated with your likelihood to be a combat veteran. And they're going to deal with that in three different ways. They're going to just directly control for whether you're a combat veteran. They're going to use draft numbers to guess at whether you're a combat veteran. And then they're going to say, let's imagine a wide range of possible effects of being a combat veteran on your earnings. How big could those effects be before they would cause significant bias in our estimates on the returns to education? Okay, so let's start with this first question, right, of whether draft numbers are sufficiently associated with your education to be used as a natural experiment. So as we saw before, right, there's some suggestive evidence that concern about the Vietnam draft likely did drive increased educational attainment, but we haven't yet seen whether having a low draft number drives increased educational attainment. So what's happening here is Angrist and Kruger have essentially regressed your draft number on your average years of education for different groups of draft numbers, right? So for very low draft number groups, medium draft number groups, and high draft number groups, and then for different years of birth, right? So essentially different cohorts that faced different draft numbers and different draft selection processes. So the punchline here is that for some groups, you see some pretty strong effects of draft number on education, right? So for example, in the 1945 cohort, if you've got a low draft number, there's a very strong association between your draft number and your your expected years of education. But a lot of these coefficients are inconsistent, right? You can see that some of these are negative, some of these are positive. That's true for the low draft number groups and for the medium draft number groups, and even for the high draft number groups. So there's a little bit of suggestive evidence here, but we don't see very, very, very strong relationships between draft number and years of education. Now, they make the argument that this is maybe not so unexpected because people's understanding of how the draft works is changing over time, and the draft itself is changing over time. So we might think that different cohorts have very different responses to being given a low draft number, both because the difficulty of receiving an educational deferment is changing, and because the understanding of the importance of an educational deferment and how your draft number affects that is changing. However, they do point out that if we just do a simple comparison of the average education of low draft number men to high draft number men, we're going to see that the low draft number men are about 5 percentage points more likely to go to college than the high draft number men, which is a pretty significant change. We can also see here, in this first set of results here, they're essentially just controlling for veteran status. In the second set of results here, what they're doing is they're also trying to predict veteran status off of draft numbers. And what you can see is it really doesn't make have much of an effect on their predictions here. Okay, so then the next step is, let's try to see if we believe that what we just saw, right, if we believe that draft number is giving us a reasonable prediction of how much education you obtained. Of course, again, it doesn't need to predict most of the variation in education. It just needs to predict enough to be treated as an experiment. What can we conclude about the effect of education on earnings from looking at draft numbers? And they're going to do this a couple of ways. First of all, they're going to look both at wages, and then they're going to look at weekly earnings. They're also going to show us both their two-stage least squares estimates, these first three columns, which are saying these are going to be the columns where they're using draft number to guess your level of education. And then they're also going to show you your OLS estimates. Actually, they're only using draft number to guess your education in columns 1 and 3. In column 2, they're just using draft number to guess veteran status. It's not very interesting. So what we can conclude here is if we look at these coefficients here, they're going to tell us the estimated effect of an extra year of education on your earnings in a percentile. So this is essentially going to tell you that an extra year of education is estimated to increase your earnings by about 6.5% if we control for veteran status, and 6.5%, the exact same effect if instead we guess your veteran status based on your draft number. In contrast, if we look at the OLS estimates, so if we ask how much higher do we expect your earnings to be if we see that you've got one additional year of education, how much is our guess of your earnings increase if we see that if your education is one year higher, that's going to be about 6%. So the 6.5% can be interpreted as a causal effect, right? This is really the effect of having a draft number that pushes you to obtain higher levels of education. And this 5.9% is going to be just a descriptive effect. In other words, it's just going to tell you the correlation between education levels and future earnings. So the main thing to draw from this is that these numbers are very, very similar to each other, and that if anything, it looks like the causal effect of education is a little bit higher than this association. So we were very worried coming into this that people who have high levels of education are different from people who have lower levels of education in ways that would increase their earnings anyway, right? That people with higher levels of education are going to be higher ability, more patient, come from wealthier families, be more socially connected, and all of that is going to mean that their earnings are going to be higher than people who get lower levels of education, even if education didn't help them at all. And this throws a little bit of cold water on that. It suggests that the effect of getting that education really is the dominant factor in why people with higher levels of education earn more than people with lower levels of education. We're going to see the same thing if we look at earnings, right? So if we look here, these columns 3 and columns 4 are going to tell us the estimated causal effect of education on earnings when we're guessing education based on your draft number. The difference between column 3 and column 4 is in column 3 we're also guessing your veteran status. Column 4 we're just guessing your education. And what we can see is, again, the causal effect of an extra year of education on earnings is estimated to be higher than the raw relationship between education and earnings in the data. So again, we're not seeing much evidence that people who choose to obtain higher levels of education for reasons other than the draft are just the type of people who are less likely to be unemployed or tend to work more than people who choose to obtain lower levels of education. And same thing if we look at an older cohort. So instead of looking at the men who came into the early stages of the Vietnam conflict, if we look at people who came into the later stages, we're going to see a very similar estimate of the effect of education on earnings. And again, it's going to be larger than this raw relationship. Okay, so the last thing that they're going to do to try to give a little more credibility to their results is they're going to say, let's imagine that we were totally not effective at measuring the effect of being a veteran on your earnings. So remember, up until this point, they've tried to measure the effect of veteran status on earnings in 2 different ways. One, by just directly controlling for whether or not you were a veteran, and second, by trying to guess at whether you're a veteran based on your draft number. And across all of these various regressions that they ran, they tended to find something between veterans earning about 5% more than non-veterans, or veterans earning about 10% less than non-veterans. In other words, they've got a range of estimates of the effect of veteran status on earnings somewhere around here. So what they do is they say, given that we find that veteran status doesn't affect earnings all that much, and that veteran status isn't all that correlated with our guess about your level of education, let's force the effect of veteran status to range from a 30% reduction in earnings over here to a 30% increase in earnings over here. In other words, they say, let's imagine kind of the broadest range of possible effects of being a veteran on your earnings that we could possibly accept, and we'll see how would our estimate of the effect of an extra year of education on your earnings change if we shifted the effect of being a veteran from negative 30% to positive 30%. And as you can see, what they're going to find is that even these very, very large effects of veteran status on earnings are not going to make a big difference in their estimate of the effect of education on earnings. And the reason for this is really just that because of the way that the draft works, their prediction about whether you're a veteran isn't all that closely connected to their prediction about whether you went to college. And similarly, their prediction about whether you went to college isn't all that closely connected to whether you were in fact a veteran, whether they actually see that you served in Vietnam. And so as a result of this, right? They can say that we don't need to worry that much about veteran status causing bias in this regression. And of course, there are other sources of bias that we might be concerned about, right? The possibility that you are more likely to move to Canada, or more likely to become a Quaker, or more likely to try to get a job as a school teacher or a bomb manufacturer or something like this in order to avoid the war. And they just brush off those concerns entirely. Essentially what they say is if we compare the massive number of people who received educational deferments to the relatively small number of people who received deferments as conscientious objectors or as essential occupations, or the number of people who left the country to avoid the draft, the numbers are just so different that those other sorts of behaviors are unlikely to be a significant source of bias. Okay, so given all of that, and if we believe their results, we need to think a little bit about what we should make of them. In other words, how we should change our beliefs about the importance of education and potentially the importance of bias in the estimation of the effect of education based on these findings. Okay, so the first thing I want to think about here is how to understand the fact that Angrist and Kruger are going to estimate a causal effect of education on earnings that's, if anything, a little bit larger than the correlation between education and earnings. In other words, their instrumental variables approach, right, where they're guessing how much education you receive based on your draft number, results in a stronger relationship between education and earnings than just comparing the earnings of people who get lots of education to the earnings of people who get less education. And this is a little surprising because when we thought through the theory of this, the big concern that we had was that people who receive high levels of education are just different from people who receive low levels of education in ways that affect earnings, right? They might have higher levels of ability or be more patient or have wealthier families or better social connections, all of which we would expect to have increased earnings. So if we think about this difference as measuring a bias in the OLS, right, a bias in our raw relationship between education and earnings, this suggests that the bias might go in the direction of less educated people earning more than more educated people if not for the education. So does that make any sense? Is there any reason to think that might be true? Well, one thing we might think about is that our expected value of education, right, given the simple model we've worked through, is something like H equals, right, A over W1 times 1 plus R, right? Where W1 is your earnings in period 1, and A is your level of ability. So one possibility here is maybe we've been focused on high ability people receiving higher levels of education when we should be focused on low W1 people receiving higher levels of education. In other words, maybe what we're capturing here is that people who are really, really good handymen or really, really good plumbers or really, really good nurses assistants, right, who are very capable in non-education in occupations that don't require a lot of education, being less willing to receive education than people who are really, really bad with their hands, don't have great customer service skills, and really need to learn some math or some science in order to get employed. So that would result in a negative bias rather than a positive bias. But there's another thing to think about that's maybe more likely to be driving this difference, which is that when we're looking at the effect of education on earnings, using the changes in education that come from receiving a low draft number rather than a higher draft number, what we're measuring is the effect of education on earnings for people who wouldn't have received that greater level of education if not for the fear of getting drafted. In other words, we're going to be measuring the effect of education on earnings for people who are only marginally attached to higher education, right, who are only barely willing to go to college. And so we might think that this is going to capture the difference between the effect of education on those people, the people who are really on the fence about college, versus the people who are going to go to college for sure anyway. Because remember, when we look at the OLS, right, this is going to be the relationship between education and earnings for everyone in this age cohort. So we're going to include among the high education people, the people who are definitely for sure going to go to college regardless, and include in the low education people, the people who are definitely for sure not going to go get higher education regardless. So the other possibility here is maybe the people who are marginally attached to college receive a bigger benefit from spending more time in school than people who were definitely going to go to college. And I'm not sure that I buy this story, but the story would essentially be, if you were going to definitely go to college anyway, maybe you have the kind of characteristics to be successful regardless. If you're the kind of person who's right on the fence, maybe you are going to benefit more from the social connections, the access to knowledge, the the access to higher quality jobs, et cetera, that come from spending more time in college. Okay. Another thing I want to spend a minute thinking about is, given the fact that Angrist and Kruger are going to be estimating the effect of college on this specific group of people, right? This group of people who only went to college because of the fact that they were afraid of getting drafted, we might want to think about whether this is a group of people that we care about or not, right? Is this the group of people for whom we want to measure the returns to education? Or would we rather be measuring the returns to education for the average person? So on the one hand, we're probably not going to say that these people who are right on the margin of going to college or not, are representative of the broader group of people who go to college. There's lots of reasons to think that might not be the case. However, we might think that they're the group of people for whom the effect of college is most interesting. And the reason for that is, any sort of policy that we might design that would encourage people to stay in college or leave college is going to affect those people who are right on the margin between dropping out and staying in school. And so if we want to know how it's going to affect earnings to provide tutoring services or cut tuition a little bit or increase access to student loans, the people who are most going to be affected by those policies are the people right on the edge of dropping out of college or not dropping out of college. And so knowing how education affects those people might be particularly interesting. On the other hand, the potential argument against the potential problem with that argument is that maybe there's a bunch of different margins on which you could just barely attend college or not. So maybe people who are just on the edge of getting drafted, who are only going to college to avoid the draft, are going to be different than people who are on the edge between going to college and not because of family financial circumstances. Okay, and the last thing I want to say before I let you guys go, the last thing I want you to think about is what this paper suggests about whether education is a good investment or not. So the first thing to point out here is the main finding of this paper, and the conclusion that Angrist and Kruger draw, is that our OLS estimates of the effect of education on earnings, that's to say basically the raw correlation between education and earnings, gives us a pretty good estimate of the effect of education on earnings. And other papers did the work of trying to figure out how to turn this rate of return, this effect of an extra year of education on someone's earnings, into a rate of return for higher education. In other words, a return on investment, the earnings you get later in life divided by the costs you pay earlier in life. And papers who have done that have generally found that about a 6% increase in earnings per year corresponds to a rate of return on education of about 10%, based on some fairly heroic assumptions about the cost of college and the length of a career and all of this sort of stuff. So if we believe that, this paper would suggest that indeed, going to college is a pretty good investment, right? It's an investment that has a return of about 10%. However, this might make us want to think about the question of how risky an investment college is. So if we had a 10% risk-free investment, that would be an amazing rate of return. Much, much better than putting your money in the bank or investing in treasury bonds or anything like this, where the rate of return is more likely going to be something like 2 or 3%. On the other hand, if this is a super risky investment, right, if there's a really good chance that you're not going to get any return from going to college, then maybe a 10% average return isn't so good. And the main thing to think about here, the main disadvantage of investing in human capital, is you're only going to get a return on investment in human capital if you end up working later in life. In other words, if you go to college, and the day after you graduate from college, you get horribly injured in a way that makes it impossible to work, you're not going to be able to recoup that investment, right? You're never going to work, so the fact that you have higher potential wages later in life isn't going to help you at all. Likewise, if you leave college and then the day after you graduate from college, you decide that you want to dedicate your life, you want to walk the earth and become a mystic or something like this, you're not going to receive any return from having invested in college. And so the big risk associated with investing in human capital is the fact that if something happens to you that reduces your ability to work, that's going to reduce your, that's going to eliminate the value of your investments at the same time that it eliminates the value of your earnings. Whereas if you put that money in the bank, right, it would be there for you regardless. Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sticking with me through this lecture, and I look forward to talking to you about this paper.